My name's Charlie Giannetti. I run a clothing factory called Giannetti Factory where we make high-end clothes for brands in Los Angeles and around the world. I've kind of been into clothes my whole life. I started doing like internships and started doing design, like working on Photoshop and Illustrator when I was really young, like 13, 14. And then really like my first brand thing started when I moved to New York. I went to NYU, and within like my first week of being in the NYU dorms, I photoshopped this t-shirt on like a rack hanging on my door in my dorm room. I photoshopped a t-shirt together and then posted it on Tumblr. I had like no Tumblr followers. And then I woke up the next morning and had like 30,000 reblogs on it. And I had like DMs from Soulja Boy and Chris Brown and like a bunch of stylists who like wanted to buy this shirt. And so I just kind of self-taught, like skateboarded up to the garment district and figured out how to make the shirt. I got super lucky. It wasn't really like my style of shirt. It was very much in like the Givenchy era. So it was like a crazy like all over print. You probably still find it on like Tumblr and Google Images and stuff. But yeah, I mean, from there, it was just like I made the shirts, posted them, and they sold out in like a minute. And I had some cash at that point. They were like $300 shirts that I sold. It's like, it was absolutely ridiculous. And then I just started making clothes with that money, you know, kind of like while going to NYU, figuring out how to make clothes, learning about patterns, all that stuff. I went to NYU just to kind of like learn, mainly just to be in New York. I mean, I knew that once I got there, I would be like more interested in I just became more and more interested in like New York itself. An internship at Karmaloop, and then I ended up also interning for this guy who was like doing like hip hop management stuff, like back in the days when like Rocky was starting out, be around a lot of that. But again, just like using Photoshop and Illustrator to do all that stuff. I took a couple classes at NYU about it, but mostly I took like classes on like Buddhism and like subaltern culture, like just trying to get like as much general knowledge as I could, because I knew I really wasn't interested in like art school and necessarily like the right way to do anything. I've always been more interested in figuring out like, hey, like what's like my way of doing all this stuff. Clothing itself, for sure. Like I started to be more and more interested in clothes. I've always had a lot of, my dad is an architect, my mom does interior design. So like design itself is really interesting to me. And like in both those industries, it's a really long lead time to like turn an idea into fruition. So like even the idea of like the factory that I have now, you know, we've got multiple pattern makers, we've got cutters, like 10 sample sewers. Like if I have an idea in the morning, I can see it by the end of the day. And so like the fully, like you can put it on by the end of the day. The fully like realized idea, I like that like fast turn of things, and that's like partially what my interest in fashion like stemmed from. It's more of like from ideation to completion, it's one of the fastest turning industries to actually like see visions come to life. That was the first time that I had like a little bit of capital and following and like interest in it. You know, I did it a couple more times while I was in New York, but I think it was also difficult because as times change and styles change, and I still like an active conversation I have today is like, do you know your audience? Being a kid in New York with no like money to spend on clothes, you know, I had no actual income from any jobs. I was like, I was getting more and more, like my taste level was increasing. I was like into Visvum, and I was into like Carol Christian Puel, and I was into all these like really high-end designers with like these minute details that were incredibly expensive. And I was like, all my friends were college kids, you know? Trying to start a brand at that level of taste is like, hey, like you're throwing $25 Riri zippers on everything because you think that's like what people want, and the reality is like that was never the customer that I was hitting. I think the two major elements of like the overseas production, like most of the people that come to me are coming to me because one, they want a certain amount of speed, right? So like it's significantly faster, the timelines that we have here. I mean, again, like you're talking 2 weeks to turn samples. If you need revisions on something, that can happen a lot faster here. And like we have similar access to materials. There's certain types of products that are just like done better in LA. Like denim is like the denim coming out of China. You can tell pretty easily that it's denim from China. I mean, even denim from Italy or denim from, you know, different markets around the world. A lot of it doesn't have that same hand feel that comes from like it's like pizza, like it comes from the water, you know? It's just like better here. So there's that element. And then also it's ideation, like the ability to do that, but along with like the control element, right? So if you're like trying to pivot into ideas and you're like, okay, I'm gonna do this in China, you're gonna wait a period of time, you're gonna try and land it boat ship, because if you air freight it, it's gonna be just as expensive as making it here. If you're boat shipping in, you're waiting, you can't do like a pre-order process, you can't like pivot to what your customers are really interested in. And for me, I'm like, the companies that we work with, their interest in LA is beyond like a national pride. It's like part of their business model. It definitely doesn't work for everyone. And I try to have really realistic and honest conversations about like, hey, if your target customer is someone who buys $20 t-shirts, like that's not gonna happen here, you know? But there's a lot of brands making, you know, building huge companies based around a $40 tee. And so if that's kind of the market that you're interested in, you want to play around with like experimental wash processes and like control your shrinkage elements and make sure that the fit is perfected. That's going to be really hard to do overseas with like any type of certainty. And like I said, like it's definitely like we are not the solution to everything. And there's a lot of products that like the US just can't really make, you know, whether that be even like techwear, you know, like that type of stuff. I don't personally know any great manufacturers in the United States for like an Arc'teryx style brand. That's going to be really, really challenging. And the cost of labor is really high. I mean, minimum wage here is a complete one-to-one reflective on the cost of goods. Even if I'm, you know, go make sure it's in Las Vegas, like it's half the minimum wage there. You can see that reflected in your clothing. And also, if you're talking about small scale production, a lot of those overseas facilities are built for this like large scale mass production. That's just the systems that they have. So what we're doing is more of like a tailored look where, hey, like you can offer to your customers, there's only 50 of these, or there's only, you know, 40, 30, 20 pieces of this style in the world. There's an element of like specialness there. That the speed part of it is definitely a target of ours, but at the end of the day, I've taken a lot of time to work with all our sewers, you know, for every team that we work with, every sewer that we have in-house, to be like, hey, like if you slow down and perfect it, like I promise that the customers will be there, because we're really targeting and really talking to those clients that are focusing on those small details, that really expect like every stitch to be perfect. And it's not always like that, but at least like that is our target, you know, and it takes training to get people to understand, like, don't sew it as fast as you possibly can. Yeah, so working in this building, there's about 60, and then on my team specifically, there's 11 people that mainly focus on like quality control, production management, outside production management. We do only like a percentage of the stuff that we, like our total output of stuff is done in-house, mostly like the most complicated stuff. But I mean, we're doing like 20,000 units a season of just denim. And with that, it's like always makes sense to work with sewing facilities that have like, you know, one guy who's been doing waistbands for 30 years and he's just really fast, like really accurate with it. So kind of like our overall scope of stuff and people that we work with, I mean, we work with 5 dye houses, all with different specialties, figuring that out. Everything we do is like, from once we land the fabric here, we manage like the cutting, the sewing, and why people work with us a lot is like, we can do, you know, 6-step processes. So we'll dye the fabric from white on the roll, then maybe we'll cut it and then send it off to embroider. And we like digitally embroider all the patterns. So we have like no limit to the size of the embroidery we can do, and everything's placed computerized. So it's not like on a ring, it's on like a flatbed. And then maybe we'll sew it and then we'll do washes to it. And within that, you know, we're testing all the shrinkage rates on everything to make sure that like the fit is right after.
That's big, yeah. That's big, because a lot of people wash their clothes or they don't really know how to wash it. They just throw it in there.
Totally, yeah. I mean, we try and think about that as much as possible. Most of the stuff that we like send out into the world, we're like telling our clients like everything needs to be pre-shrunk, you know? Yeah. It all is like a lot of focus on that, unless it's a wool jacket or something, you know? Besides that, we're really focusing on like, hey, we want to make sure that like your product is going to last in the customer's hand. First internship was at Karmaloop. And I was doing like design assistant stuff, so that's really how I learned how to do like CAD work and Illustrator. I mean, I think like I get asked a lot like pieces of advice, you know, and from me, I'm like, I do Photoshop, Illustrator. I'm really fast at both, but I also learned like product photography, like I know lighting setups, all that as well. I also like write code, like HTML. I built all the websites for our website, the brands that we work with, like the brands that I've worked on personally. Within that, I was like, all the internships I ever did were like kind of picking up in different directions. And so with that, like people often ask like how I got here. And I was like, it's kind of just been like one progressive path. A lot of people like, you'll go out and you'll learn something like completely random. And I'm like, I've just so happened to like everything I've ever learned, I use almost every day. We're learning every day just how to like add additional steps, like a problem pops up, and as opposed to just like fixing the problem, you're filling it with a solution, right? That's gonna stop that problem from happening again and again. So like I say over the last like 6 years, like as long as we don't make the same mistake twice, you know, things are always gonna happen, but really figuring out like, hey, how do we like better the system? How do we assign responsibilities to the right people who can affect the change that needs to happen to make sure that, again, like the last thing is as good as it could possibly be. Honestly, like the only people who I talk to about the business side of the company are my parents. You know, like my dad has had his own architecture firm, and obviously there's a lot of differences there. But from like a business standpoint and a creative standpoint, I mean, essentially how we work is like an interior design, like service. It's like almost runs the same. We're really transparent with all the costs on everything. Everything shows like exactly what sewing costs, what mark and grading costs, what cutting costs, what materials cost. And we are like really transparent that we just like put a margin on those things. And for most of the brands, it works for them because they don't have to hire a ton of people to do all those things. We manage the full process. So it hasn't been, we try to keep it as like simple as possible to not need like all these like outside mentorships and stuff. But obviously we've had a lot of help along the way. And the majority of people who've helped us are actually like the other contractors that we use and people who've really like come to me with ideas or things that I can offer to my clients. And that's what's made us like indispensable to so many of the brands that we work with. I literally got a old automotive repair shop in Eagle Rock that I rented. It was $2,500 a month, and I found 3 good sewers, 1 pattern maker and 3 sewers that were like just really good sewers, but they were in like the 2nd floor of this random building in the middle of nowhere. And I was like, guys, like if I move you into this building and cover your rent, like will you prioritize my stuff? You know, they needed more people to help, so we brought on more people. Yeah, I don't do any advertising. I barely post on social media. The reality is like I don't take any ownership of like the product that I make. So like my thing is like I'm here as like a service provider to all the brands that I work with. So for me it's like, you know, we get a lot of, I'm like super grateful that my clients give us like a lot of respect, a lot of freedom, a lot of like creative input into like, hey, what's the best way to execute this idea, you know? And so with that, I don't like use that as a marketing tool to get other people. The reality is that like, because of where the business is at also, I'm like, it's very difficult for me at this point to work with like people who are just starting their brands. I tell people it's really not like, it's not a personal thing, that I could think you're the greatest designer in the entire world. Like your sketches are incredible. And I'm like, hey, like realistically, like we're running a company here. I have to have my team focus on projects where we can have as much communication as the brand wants, but like I can afford to pay people to have that communication. Like I totally understand somebody comes in and they're trying to make like 1 hoodie and a sweatpant. And for them, it's like, you know, they saved up money, they like pulled it all together and they like, it's the most important thing in their life. And I'm like, guys, like for me, I'm also managing like a 40-piece collection with like, you know, 1,000 pieces per piece. I can't give you 2 hours and give them 2 hours. Because of that element, because I can't help everybody, I'm working on a blanks program that's gonna be like, you know, right now I'm thinking it'll be kind of like a subscription website where like if you pay like a really small monthly fee, you get access to the blanks program, and then we'll have like a tiered system. So if it's like, hey, like you want to achieve this wash, for example, like I don't know anybody in the market right now that you can go to and be like, I want to do crystal dyes or pigment sprays or like get this like tie-dye, this element on the blank, and then like do this like crazy embroidery in the screen print. So I'm working on doing like that kind of for everyone to at least like get a little bit further along so that I can actually have time to then help them be like, okay, like you're doing like really well with sales. Like you clearly have a customer base. Let's talk about cut and sew, you know? So I'm working on that side of stuff. And then, yeah, from a growth perspective, I mean, I'm always looking to just make sure that we can support like everyone who comes to us, you know? So I'm less growth driven from like an actively pursuing any brands or like trying to get like huge companies to work with us, and more like, hey, like if you guys are growing, we need to grow as well. If a brand that we're working with has a 10,000 piece order, we just need to make sure that we're able to fulfill that and like the timelines that the client needs and make sure that that gets done. So there's like always just like a natural growth that happens there.